This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The mountain fog rolled thick through Mercer County, West Virginia, on the morning of October 15, 1962, when Dr. Cornelius Vance first arrived in the hamlet of Stillwater Creek. Population 47, according to the faded wooden sign that marked the town limits, though Vance would later discover that number had remained unchanged on official records for nearly 3 decades. The sign itself seemed to lean at an unnatural angle, as if the earth beneath it had shifted and settled in ways that defied the natural order of things. Vance, a cultural anthropologist from Marshall University, had come to document the oral traditions of Appalachian communities for his doctoral dissertation. At 34, he was methodical in his approach to field work, carrying with him a leather satchel containing recording equipment, notebooks, and letters of introduction from the university. What he expected to find was folklore, mountain ballads, and perhaps some interesting dialect variations. What he discovered instead would consume the remaining 8 years of his life and ultimately lead to his complete withdrawal from academic society. The town of Stillwater Creek sat in a natural depression between 2 ridges, accessible only by a single gravel road that wound through dense forest for 7 miles before connecting to the nearest paved highway. The settlement consisted of 11 houses, a general store that doubled as a post office, and a small white chapel with windows boarded over with weathered planks. Most of the buildings dated from the 1880s, constructed when coal mining briefly brought prosperity to the region. When the mines played out in the early 1900s, most families moved on, leaving behind only those with the deepest roots or the strongest reasons to stay. Vance's first interview was with Ezekiel Thorne, the unofficial mayor and proprietor of the general store. Thorne, a man of 68, with hands permanently stained black from decades of handling coal, spoke in the measured cadences typical of mountain folk. When asked about local traditions, he provided standard responses about seasonal celebrations and hunting customs. But when Vance inquired about the boarded chapel, Thorne's demeanor shifted perceptibly. "Ain't been services there since before the war," Thorne said, referring to what Vance initially assumed was World War II. "Building got unsafe. Foundation problems." The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but Vance noticed how Thorne's eyes avoided direct contact when discussing the church. More telling was the way conversation in the store ceased entirely whenever the subject arose. Other patrons who had been chatting easily about weather and crops would find sudden urgent business elsewhere or simply fall silent until the topic changed. Over the following days, Vance conducted interviews with other longtime residents. Minerva Caldwell, a spinster of 73 who had taught in the town's one-room schoolhouse until its closure in 1954, spoke eloquently about local history up until a certain point. When her narrative reached the autumn of 1934, she would pause, as if searching for words, then skip ahead to events after the war. Similar gaps appeared in other accounts. The period between 1934 and 1945 seemed to exist in a collective blind spot. Delphine Sawyer, whose family had settled in the area before the Civil War, maintained detailed genealogical records going back 5 generations. Her handwritten family trees and birth records were meticulous, with one notable exception. Several family lines simply ended abruptly in the mid-1930s, with no notation of death, departure, or marriage. When questioned about these missing branches, Sawyer would only say that some people chose to leave and weren't spoken of anymore. The pattern emerged gradually. Conversations that touched on the Depression years became stilted and careful. Residents who had been forthcoming about other topics would excuse themselves or change the subject. Even more curious was the complete absence of anyone born between 1935 and 1946. In a community where families typically had multiple offspring, an entire generation seemed to have vanished from the record. Vance's academic training had taught him to recognize when communities were protecting secrets. Often these involved economic crimes during hard times, family scandals, or conflicts with outside authorities. He approached the mystery with professional detachment, assuming he would eventually uncover something mundane that had grown into local taboo through decades of silence. The breakthrough came during his third week in Stillwater Creek. While examining records in the shuttered schoolhouse, Vance discovered a wooden crate containing school attendance records, lesson plans, and student compositions from the 1920s and early 1930s. Most were routine examples of rural education from the period, but buried among arithmetic exercises and penmanship samples was a folder marked Special Studies, 1934, in faded ink. Inside were essays written by students about local legends and family stories. The assignments appeared to be part of a project documenting community folklore. Most essays recounted familiar mountain tales about lost travelers and mysterious lights. But 3 compositions, all dated September 1934, described something called the Covenant of Silence and referenced an event that had saved the town from great evil. The essays were written in the careful script of teenage students. One, authored by someone named Prudence Blackthorne, described a gathering where the grown folks made promises to keep certain truths buried so that the children could live in peace. Gira. Another, signed J. Whitmore, mentioned that grandfather said some knowledge is too heavy for young minds and must be carried only by those strong enough to bear it without breaking. Most intriguing was the third essay, written by M. Caldwell, presumably a young Minerva. Her account was more detailed. On the night when the moon was dark and the mountain spirits walked among us, the elders gathered in the old chapel to make sacred vows. They swore that certain names would never again be spoken aloud, that certain places would remain untrodden, and that the truth of what transpired in the hollow would die with them rather than poison future generations. Mother says this covenant saved us all from madness, but I do not understand what could be so terrible that even speaking of it would bring harm. Vance spent days analyzing these documents, comparing handwriting and cross-referencing names. The M. Caldwell was undoubtedly the same Minerva Caldwell he had interviewed, though now in her 70s. The fact that she had written about the covenant as a teenager but claimed no knowledge of it as an adult suggested either a failure of memory or a deliberate suppression of information. Attempts to question Caldwell about her own essay met with firm denial. She examined the paper carefully, acknowledged that it appeared to be her handwriting from that period, but insisted she had no recollection of writing it or of the events it described. Her confusion seemed genuine, as if the memories had been carefully excised from her consciousness. Similar reactions occurred when Vance showed the essays to other longtime residents. Those whose names appeared as authors recognized their own youthful penmanship but claimed no memory of the content. The uniform nature of this selective amnesia was too consistent to be natural. It suggested a community-wide effort to forget specific information while retaining all other memories from the period. The essays mentioned the hollow as a location central to whatever had occurred. Vance consulted topographical maps and discovered that Stillwater Creek was surrounded by several small valleys and ravines. Most were accessible by foot trails and showed evidence of occasional use by hunters or hikers. But one particular hollow, located roughly 2 miles southeast of town, appeared on older maps but had been excluded from more recent surveys. When Vance asked residents for directions to this location, he was invariably told that the area was dangerous due to unstable rock formations or impassable undergrowth. Determined to investigate despite local warnings, Vance set out alone on a crisp morning in early November. The trail was difficult to follow and had obviously not been maintained for decades, but signs of its former use were still visible. Broken branches had been deliberately placed to obscure the path, and several times Vance found crude barriers constructed from fallen logs and stones, as if someone had tried to make the route as unwelcoming as possible. The hollow itself was a narrow depression between steep rock walls, perhaps 50 yards wide and extending back into the mountain for several hundred yards. Ancient trees created a canopy so dense that even in late autumn, with most leaves fallen, the interior remained in perpetual twilight. The air felt noticeably colder and carried an odd dampness that seemed unrelated to recent weather conditions. At the far end of the hollow, Vance discovered the remains of what had once been a substantial structure. Only foundation stones and a partially collapsed stone chimney remained, but the layout suggested a building much larger than typical mountain cabins. Scattered among the ruins were fragments of metal that appeared to be remnants of specialized equipment, gears, pipes, and mechanical components that seemed out of place in such a remote location. More disturbing were the human artifacts, pieces of rotted fabric, buttons, and what appeared to be fragments of bone were scattered throughout the area. These remains did not appear to represent a single burial or even a small number of deaths. The distribution pattern suggested something more extensive had occurred at this site. Near the foundation ruins, Vance found a metal box, heavily corroded but still partially intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from decades of moisture, were documents that would prove to be the most significant discovery of his investigation. The papers consisted of correspondence, meeting minutes, and what appeared to be financial records dating from 1933 to 1934. The documents revealed that Stillwater Creek had been selected as a testing site for what was euphemistically termed a community improvement initiative. The project was sponsored by a coalition of government agencies and private institutions studying social engineering and behavioral modification in isolated populations. The goal, according to the papers, was to determine whether specific psychological techniques could be used to permanently alter collective memory and social behavior in small communities. Dr. Aldrich Hartman, identified in the documents as the project director, had established a research facility in the Hollow during the summer of 1934. His team consisted of psychologists, medical researchers, and specialists in what they termed applied anthropology. The residents of Stillwater Creek were to serve as unwitting test subjects for experiments in mass memory manipulation and social control. The methodology, as outlined in Hartman's reports, involved exposing community members to a combination of chemical agents, psychological conditioning, and social pressure designed to create artificial traumatic memories. These false experiences would be so disturbing that the community would voluntarily suppress all discussion of the period, effectively erasing any evidence of the experiments. The researchers believed they could create a controlled amnesia that would protect their work from discovery while allowing them to study long-term effects on community behavior. Initial reports suggested the experiment was proceeding as planned. Community members who were secretly administered experimental compounds began exhibiting symptoms of anxiety, disorientation, and fragmented memory. The researchers documented their observations with clinical detachment, noting how subjects' behavior changed and how the community adapted to protect its most vulnerable members. But the final documents told a different story. Hartman's last report, dated October 31, 1934, was markedly different in tone from earlier entries. Rather than the confident scientific language of previous communications, this final document revealed growing concern about unintended consequences and complications beyond our initial parameters. According to this report, the experimental subjects had begun to exhibit symptoms that exceeded the researchers' expectations. Instead of simply developing false memories, participants were experiencing what Hartman described as complete personality dissolution. Subjects would lose all sense of individual identity for days at a time, existing in a state of almost catatonic compliance. When they recovered, they retained no memory of what they had done or said during these episodes. More disturbing was Hartman's observation that the condition appeared to be spreading beyond those who had been directly exposed to the experimental compounds. Family members and neighbors began exhibiting similar symptoms through what could only be described as psychological contagion. The entire community was descending into a collective state of dissociation that threatened to become permanent. The research team had lost control of their experiment. What was meant to be a precisely calibrated program of memory modification had become a spreading psychological catastrophe that threatened to destroy the community entirely. Hartman's final entry concluded with a stark admission. We have created something we cannot control or reverse. Immediate termination of all research activities is required to prevent total collapse of subject population. The documents ended abruptly at this point, with no indication of what steps were taken to address the crisis. But the evidence suggested that the researchers had indeed withdrawn, abandoning both their facility and their test subjects to deal with the aftermath of the failed experiment. The community had been left to find their own solution to the psychological damage that had been inflicted upon them. Vance began to understand what had actually happened in Stillwater Creek during those missing years. The covenant of silence described in the student essays had not been a supernatural pact, but a desperate survival strategy. The community had instinctively recognized that their only hope of recovery lay in completely suppressing all memory of the traumatic period. By refusing to speak of what they had experienced, they had gradually allowed the artificial memories and induced psychological states to fade, replacing them with deliberate ignorance. The strategy had worked, but at tremendous cost. An entire generation had been lost, not through death or departure, but through the systematic erasure of their identities and experiences. Those who had been most severely affected by the experiments had been cared for by the community until they died, but their existence had been carefully erased from all records and memories. The people who remained had rebuilt their lives around a carefully maintained void, protecting themselves and future generations from knowledge they believed too dangerous to possess. Armed with this understanding, Vance began to recognize signs of the Covenant's ongoing influence. Conversations that died when certain topics arose were not evidence of simple secretiveness, but of active psychological protection. The community had trained itself to recognize and avoid any discussion that might trigger recovered memories of the experimental period. The boarded chapel had likely been the site where community leaders met to formalize their agreement to forget, making it a location too psychologically charged to remain in normal use. The uniform gaps in family records reflected the same protective instinct. Rather than maintain documentation that might prompt uncomfortable questions, families had simply allowed certain lineages to disappear from official memory. Children born during the experimental period had grown up in a community that had collectively agreed to forget their early years, resulting in individuals with mysteriously fragmented personal histories. Even more subtle was the way the community had unconsciously structured itself to prevent the return of dangerous knowledge. The isolation of Stillwater Creek was not merely geographic but psychological. Residents rarely traveled far from home, and outsiders were politely discouraged from extended visits. This isolation protected the community from external influences that might challenge their carefully maintained amnesia. Vance realized he was witnessing the results of one of the most successful cover-ups in modern history. Not because evidence had been destroyed or witnesses silenced, but because an entire community had voluntarily chosen to forget. The victims of the experiment had become willing participants in concealing their own victimization, recognizing that remembering would be more damaging than forgetting. But Vance's investigation had inadvertently begun to threaten this protective amnesia. His questions were stirring memories that had been successfully suppressed for nearly 3 decades. Several residents began experiencing disturbing dreams and episodes of confusion after their interviews. Minerva Caldwell, in particular, seemed to be struggling with fragmentary recollections that left her agitated and disoriented. The community's response was swift and decisive. Vance found himself increasingly unwelcome in Stillwater Creek. Residents who had previously been cooperative began to avoid him. His requests for additional interviews were politely refused. The general store began running out of supplies he needed, and his accommodations at the local boarding house became suddenly unavailable. The message was clear. His presence was endangering the community's psychological stability. By pursuing his research, Vance was threatening to unravel the protective rigging that had allowed Stillwater Creek to survive the aftermath of Hartman's experiments. The residents were not consciously aware of why they needed him to leave, but their collective instinct for self-preservation was as strong as it had been 30 years earlier. Faced with this resistance, Vance made the decision to withdraw from Stillwater Creek in December 1962. But he took with him copies of all the documents he had discovered, determined to expose what had been done to this isolated community. His initial plan was to publish his findings as both an academic paper and a popular exposé, ensuring that the perpetrators of this psychological experiment could not escape accountability. However, as Vance began drafting his report, he encountered an unexpected problem. The more he wrote about what he had discovered, the more he began to question the ethics of his own actions. Was he justified in destroying the community's hard-won peace in service of historical truth? The residents of Stillwater Creek had found a way to heal from their trauma through collective forgetting. By exposing their story, he would be inflicting new wounds on people who had already suffered enough. The moral complexity of the situation deepened when Vance attempted to research Dr. Aldrich Hartman and his team. Government records from the period were heavily classified, and requests for information were either denied or simply ignored. The few leads he could pursue suggested that similar experiments had been conducted in other isolated communities throughout Appalachia during the 1930s. If his discoveries led to broader investigations, dozens of communities might be forced to confront carefully suppressed traumas. Months of internal struggle led Vance to a conclusion that surprised even him. He decided to honor the community's covenant of silence, recognizing that some truths might indeed be too damaging to expose. His completed research files were sealed and deposited in a private collection with instructions that they remain closed for 50 years. His published dissertation focused on harmless folklore and dialect studies, making no mention of Stillwater Creek or psychological experimentation. But the knowledge he had gained proved impossible for Vance to live with comfortably. Knowing what had been done to the people of Stillwater Creek and understanding how many other communities might have suffered similar fates left him in a state of chronic psychological distress. He began experiencing symptoms remarkably similar to those described in Hartman's research notes: fragmented memory, periods of dissociation, and a growing inability to distinguish between authentic experiences and artificially implanted thoughts. By 1968, Vance had withdrawn almost entirely from academic life. Colleagues described him as increasingly paranoid and obsessed with conspiracy theories. He claimed to receive threatening communications warning him not to discuss his research, though no evidence of such threats was ever found. His behavior became so erratic that Marshall University was forced to place him on indefinite leave from his teaching position. Vance's final years were spent in near complete isolation at a small cabin in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. He maintained extensive correspondence with other researchers investigating government psychological experiments, but his letters grew increasingly incoherent over time. His last known communication, dated September 1970, consisted of a single sentence repeated dozens of times. Some knowledge is too heavy for any mind to carry alone. The cabin was found empty in October 1970. Vance's personal effects remained undisturbed, but he was never seen again. Local authorities conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area, but found no trace of him. The case was officially classified as a missing person investigation, though no evidence of foul play was ever discovered. Some investigators theorized that Vance had simply walked into the wilderness and died of exposure, overwhelmed by psychological burdens he could no longer bear. His research materials, including the documents from Stillwater Creek, disappeared along with him. The private collection where his papers had been deposited claimed that their security had been breached and that several boxes of documents had been stolen, though, again, no evidence of a break-in was found. With Vance's disappearance, the only surviving evidence of what had occurred in Stillwater Creek during the 1930s vanished as well. The community itself continued to thrive in its carefully maintained ignorance. Population levels remained stable, families continued their traditional occupations, and life proceeded with the quiet dignity characteristic of mountain communities. Visitors who occasionally found their way to Stillwater Creek encountered a perfectly ordinary small town with friendly residents and unremarkable local customs. The boarded chapel was eventually demolished in 1975, after the foundation finally became genuinely unstable. No ceremony marked its destruction, and no effort was made to preserve any historical materials from the site. The cleared lot became a small community garden where residents grew vegetables and flowers with impressive success, as if the earth itself was eager to nurture new life after decades of supporting structures associated with painful memories. Only one artifact remained to hint at the community's hidden history. In the general store, prominently displayed on a shelf behind the counter, sat an old glass jar containing what appeared to be ordinary mountain spring water. Ezekiel Thorne's son, who inherited the business in 1969, maintained the jar exactly as his father had left it. When asked about its significance, the younger Thorne would smile and say only that it was water from the healing spring, and that some traditions were worth preserving even when their origins were forgotten. Regular customers understood that the jar was not to be disturbed or questioned. It served as a reminder of something important, though no one could quite articulate what that might be. Children growing up in the community learned instinctively to respect the jar's presence without needing explanations. It had become a totem of successful forgetting, a symbol of the community's ability to honor its past without being destroyed by it. The hollow, where Hartman had conducted his experiments, was gradually reclaimed by nature. Trees grew through the foundation ruins, their roots breaking apart the remaining stone and metal. Seasonal floods washed away most of the human debris, scattering it downstream until nothing remained to mark the site as significant. Hunters occasionally passed through the area, but none lingered or found anything worth investigating. Local wildlife had returned to the hollow in abundance, suggesting that whatever had once made the place unwelcoming was no longer present. Deer grazed peacefully among the overgrown ruins, and birds nested in the trees that had sprouted from the collapsed research facility. Nature's own form of forgetting had proved even more thorough than the community's deliberate amnesia. By the 1980s, even the oldest residents of Stillwater Creek had no conscious memory of why certain topics had once been forbidden or why specific locations had been avoided. The protective habits established during the years following Hartman's experiments had become simple cultural traditions, observed without question or analysis. Young people who left the community for education or employment in larger towns sometimes found these customs difficult to explain to outsiders, but rarely questioned their importance. The success of the community's collective amnesia was perhaps best demonstrated by its complete invisibility. No academic studies identified Stillwater Creek as unusual or historically significant. Government records contained no references to psychological experiments conducted in the area. Even local historians researching Appalachian communities during the Depression era found nothing worthy of special attention in the town's thoroughly ordinary documentation. The people of Stillwater Creek had achieved something remarkable. They had successfully erased a traumatic episode from history without destroying themselves in the process. Their covenant of silence had protected not just their own peace of mind, but the integrity of their community's future. By choosing to forget, they had ensured that the damage inflicted by Hartman's experiments could not spread to subsequent generations. Yet questions remained for anyone willing to look closely enough to see them. Why did population records show such unusual stability over decades when most rural communities experienced significant fluctuation? Why were certain family lines missing from genealogical records that were otherwise meticulously maintained? Why did the community maintain such consistent isolation from neighboring areas despite good transportation links? The answers existed in the careful spaces between what was recorded and what was omitted. In the subtle patterns of behavior that had become so natural they were no longer noticed. Stillwater Creek had become a community built around a void, shaped by the absence of memories too dangerous to preserve. The residents lived comfortably within this void, protected by ignorance they had chosen and maintained through generations of careful not knowing. And perhaps that was the most unsettling aspect of the entire story. How successfully a community could adapt to the deliberate suppression of its own history. The people of Stillwater Creek were not victims in any conventional sense. They were survivors who had found an effective way to heal from psychological trauma by embracing strategic forgetting. Their solution worked because they had made it work through collective will and mutual protection. The implications extended far beyond one small mountain community. If Hartman's experiments had been conducted elsewhere, other communities might have found similar solutions to similar traumas. How many other places had developed their own covenants of silence? How many other towns existed where certain topics were avoided, certain questions unasked, certain memories deliberately suppressed? How many communities had successfully erased their own painful histories so thoroughly that even their existence had been forgotten? The possibility that such places might be scattered throughout the region, each protecting its own carefully maintained amnesia, suggested a landscape haunted not by supernatural forces, but by the more mundane horror of systematic psychological experimentation. Communities that appeared perfectly normal might be concealing decades-old traumas behind facades of rustic charm and traditional values. For those who suspected the existence of such places, the ethical questions were complex. Was it morally justified to investigate communities that had found peace through forgetting? Did the historical importance of documenting government experimentation outweigh the potential harm of forcing people to remember experiences they had chosen to suppress? Who had the right to determine which truths should be preserved and which should be allowed to disappear? These questions became particularly relevant in light of emerging information about psychological experiments conducted by various government agencies throughout the 20th century. As more details about programs like MKUltra became public, researchers began to wonder how many smaller, localized experiments might have been conducted in isolated communities where subjects could be easily controlled and outcomes readily concealed. The pattern suggested by Stillwater Creek implied a systematic program of rural experimentation that had left communities throughout Appalachia carrying hidden scars. If true, this represented one of the most extensive psychological research programs in American history, conducted on unwilling subjects who had been specifically selected for their isolation and powerlessness. But proving such theories would require exactly the kind of investigation that communities like Stillwater Creek had organized themselves to resist. Any researcher attempting to uncover suppressed memories would face the same moral dilemma that had ultimately defeated Cornelius Vance. The knowledge they sought might be too damaging to pursue, and the act of seeking it might inflict new trauma on people who had already suffered enough. The story of Stillwater Creek thus became a cautionary tale about the limits of historical investigation and the sometimes conflicting demands of truth and compassion. It demonstrated that some secrets might be worth keeping, not because they protected the guilty, but because they protected the innocent. The community's covenant of silence had been an act of collective self-preservation that deserved respect rather than violation, yet the knowledge that such places existed continued to trouble those who learned of them. The idea that entire communities might be living with carefully hidden psychological wounds challenged assumptions about the transparency of American social history. It suggested that the official record might be missing not just documents and testimony, but entire categories of experience that had been systematically erased. The mountains of Appalachia, with their tradition of isolation and self-reliance, had provided ideal conditions for both the original experiments and the subsequent cover-up. Communities that were accustomed to handling their own problems without outside interference were well equipped to develop protective amnesia when necessary. Their cultural values of privacy and mutual support made collective forgetting not just possible, but natural. This cultural framework also explained why such communities could maintain their amnesia so effectively over time. The same social structures that had originally protected them from external exploitation continued to protect them from unwanted investigation. Outsiders who asked too many questions or showed too much interest in local history would find themselves gently but firmly discouraged from pursuing their inquiries. The success of these protective mechanisms was demonstrated by their invisibility. Despite decades of historical research into Appalachian culture and society, no mainstream academic study had identified the pattern of systematic amnesia that characterized communities like Stillwater Creek. The gaps in historical records were attributed to poverty, lack of education, or simple disinterest in documentation rather than deliberate suppression of specific memories. This oversight was not accidental. Researchers approached these communities with preconceptions about rural Appalachian culture that made them unlikely to recognize evidence of psychological experimentation. They expected to find folklore, dialect variations, and traditional crafts, not sophisticated strategies for managing collective trauma. The community's protective amnesia was hidden within cultural stereotypes that made it effectively invisible to academic investigation. The few researchers like Vance who did stumble upon evidence of hidden histories faced a choice between professional advancement and ethical responsibility. Publishing their discoveries would bring academic recognition, but would also violate the privacy and psychological safety of vulnerable communities. Most chose to respect the community's right to maintain their protective silence, leaving the historical record incomplete but the people themselves unharmed. This pattern of respectful non-investigation had allowed places like Stillwater Creek to maintain their careful balance between remembering enough to function and forgetting enough to survive. The communities continued to thrive precisely because their most painful experiences remained buried. Their children grew up healthy and normal because they were protected from knowledge that might have damaged their psychological development. The cost of this protection was the loss of historical truth, but for the communities involved, this seemed a reasonable price to pay. They had experienced firsthand the damage that certain types of knowledge could inflict, and they had chosen healing over historical accuracy. Their decision to forget had been made collectively and maintained consistently because it served their fundamental need for psychological survival. And so Stillwater Creek continued to exist much as it always had, a small mountain community where people lived quietly and minded their own business. Visitors found friendly residents, beautiful scenery, and an atmosphere of peaceful isolation that seemed untouched by the complexities of modern life. The community's success at protecting itself was measured by how thoroughly normal it appeared to outsiders who had no reason to suspect that anything unusual had ever occurred there. The jar of spring water behind the counter at the general store remained the only visible reminder of mysteries that had been deliberately forgotten. Even longtime residents could no longer explain its significance, though they continued to treat it with unconscious reverence. It had become a symbol without a story, a memorial to experiences that could no longer be safely remembered. On quiet evenings when mist rolled through the mountains and the community settled into familiar routines, Stillwater Creek embodied the profound peace that could be achieved through successful forgetting. The residents went about their lives unburdened by knowledge of what their community had endured and overcome. They had found a way to honor their past without being trapped by it, to remember what they needed to remember while forgetting what they needed to forget. The broader implications of their story remained largely unknown and unexplored. Somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, other communities might be maintaining similar silences, protecting similar secrets, preserving similar peace through similar amnesia. The full extent of what had been done to these isolated places and what they had done to protect themselves remained hidden in the spaces between official records and forgotten memories. Perhaps that was as it should be. Some knowledge truly might be too heavy for individual minds to carry, and some truths might be too dangerous for communities to preserve. The people of Stillwater Creek had made their choice based on hard experience and collective wisdom. They had chosen survival over history, healing over truth, and peace over justice. Their success in maintaining that choice for more than 30 years suggested that sometimes forgetting was the wisest form of remembering.